Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Today marks the beginning of a new quarter of lessons. We have completed our study from Luke's Gospel in the New Testament, a study I thoroughly enjoyed. Now we're going to turn to Old Testament books. A couple of the books sometimes referred to as wisdom literature, Job and Ecclesiastes. We begin with Job, and we will look at the first chapter of Job, sometimes called the Prologue to Job. There's quite a few verses to cover, and that causes me time problems, and so let me try to jump in as quickly as possible. Our curriculum writers tell us that our focal verses are verses 8 through 22 out of chapter 1. But it's so difficult to understand, or it is so important to cover the verses before verse 8 that it just adds to the number of verses and the time that it takes to finish. So let's look at a little bit about Job. Let's have some understanding of the book itself. The book begins in verse 1 identifying the main character, the primary or central character. Who's Job? So we ask, who is the author of Job, and when was the book written? The direct answer to who is the author is we're not sure. We don't know. The author is unknown. Some suggest that Job himself is the author of the book of Job. I frankly think that is a good thought. Job is probably the author. But then we would ask, well, who is Job? Again, we're not certain other than what is recorded in the book itself. And helping us maybe get some handle on whom Job might be, we might look to the time of writing of Job. There are those who believe that the book of Job may be the first written or the first writing that exists in our Bible, that Job may have been written sometime between or sometime before Abraham himself. The fact that it is an ancient writing is without question. Sometime perhaps in Genesis, it would be the timing or around the time frames covered by the book of Genesis between Noah and Abraham. Others say it's possible that the book of Job was written later between Jacob and the time of Jacob and Esau. There's some support, but I think a little bit better support is that it was written before Abraham, after Noah. Looking in Genesis, trying to find my note, chapter 10, verse 29, or the verses in chapter 10 of Genesis, there is the lineage listed of Noah after the flood. There's a listing of Noah's three sons and their children, those three sons and their sons. And in verse 29, there's a reference to Jobab, Jobab. as one of the descendants of Shem, one of Noah's sons. Then if that is accurate, and that is the person who we see as Job in the book of Job, then it is after Noah but before Abraham. And obviously he would have had his deep and true relationship with God passed on to him from the ancestry of Noah and his sons. Maybe he is like Melchizedek, who appeared in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 24. It just appears on the scene as someone who is a worshiper and follower of God. But he would be tracing his lineage, if the earlier dating of Job is accurate, from Noah. As I say, there are some who think maybe it would be later. Verse 1 says, in the land of Uz, U-Z. We don't know exactly where that is, but it's believed that it's probably near Edom, which would be southeast of Israel, or the Holy Lands, the Palestine. The first few verses indicate that Job was blameless. Now, it doesn't say he is sinless, but rather that he is blameless. And there is a major difference between sinless and blameless. Sinless would be a matter of vertical, man to God. That is where sinfulness is determined. Blameless would be horizontal. That is, he lived blameless among men. No one would contend or claim that he was a person of moral failure. His reputation instead was impeccable. That does not mean he did not sin. He was not, and we should not think that he is sinless. Only Jesus ever lived on this earth without sin. And it's important that we note, and thus I'm covering it, these first essentially 5 verses of chapter 1, because there will be later efforts by Job's friends or acquaintances to suggest that maybe he has been less than blameless, and that he is getting what he deserves for sinfulness. Again, a mixing of the two concepts. But even Job never claimed to be without sin. He is just very righteous and has a trusting reliance relationship with God himself, which sets up the book and this lesson, the entire book, and today's lesson. We are not going into the entire book in today's lesson, just this first chapter. And although our curriculum writers began at verse 8, again, we need to, I think, begin at verse 6 to understand exactly what's going on. There are 2 stages in this story. One is heaven, one is earth. And we need to see the first as well as the second. So let's begin at verse 6, and let's look at verses 6 through 12 for our study this morning. And I'm reading from the New International Version for those of you who like to follow along. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Well, let's look to see what these verses are saying to us so that we might better understand the lesson presented by the book of Job. There was a day, we look at a scene in heaven. Job does not see it, but the book presents it to us and allows us to understand. Job is not going to see and understand everything in heaven, and nor even on earth. But it is absolutely real, nevertheless. We can only fully and properly understand the book of Job by taking into account what happens in heaven and also being aware that there is an earthly perspective as well. The sons of God, verse 6 and 7 talks about the sons of God. Almost certainly this phrase in the Old Testament is talking about angelic beings. So angels are gathered around God. And among them, Satan also comes along. The fact that Satan comes along shows that Satan is himself an angelic being and that he is not an equal to God. In some, too often, and probably to the great delight of Satan, equate Satan's status to that of God. That is, he is the opposite of God. If God is light, Satan is darkness. God is hot, Satan is cold. Well, certainly Satan wishes he were the opposite of God. He attempts throughout biblical history and even in these times to elevate himself to the status of equality with God. But God wants us to know that Satan is a mere creature and is in no way equal to or even the opposite of God. If Satan has someone he might equate to, it would be one of the upper levels of angels, maybe Michael or Gabriel, Michael probably being a better comparison. But our purpose is not to compare Michael to Satan, but to study man's relationship, Job's relationship with God. All right. The fact that the angels and Satan, being an angelic figure, a created figure himself, as related here, shows that they do have access. Even Satan has access to God. Look at some other Old Testament references. We won't go into them because of time, but 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 21, Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1. But also look at Revelations chapter 12, verse 9. And one day, Satan and his angels, or his followers, will be cast out of heaven totally and banished, first to the earth and ultimately to the lake of fire, which I think of as hell itself. God, noticing Satan, says, "Where have you been, or where are you coming from?" Not that God doesn't already know, but he is asking for Satan's report. And Satan says, I've been going to and from on the earth, which shows he has free access on the earth. Peter, in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, refers to Satan as a roaring lion roaming the earth seeking to destroy and devour. Satan certainly has interposed an active interest in what happens here on earth. God says, have you considered my servant Job? Now let's pause for a moment, because although God brings Job up as a subject for discussion, it's obvious that Satan has considered not only Job, but he considers everyone. He is looking for those, as Peter says in 1 Peter, to whom he can devour and destroy. What does Satan see when he considers man on earth? One, he sees a difference between himself and man. He sees a relationship between man and God. He sees that while he has fallen, these creatures on earth we call man still stand in a relationship with God. And now through Jesus, God's Son, we have a right relationship with him. And Satan sees that and is distressed. But back to God calling Job to Satan's attention. God says he is a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. In other words, stays away from you. So God pronounces Job as a man of character. Now, again, God did not say he was sinless. He said he was blameless. But we need to remember this first paragraph this first part of chapter 1 as we proceed through the rest of Job, because there are going to be some who suggest that Job is less than blameless. Even Job himself is going to be asking questions of God. But when his friends suggest that he may be something less than blameless, we need to realize it is from their perspective that they make these almost accusations, and not from God. God says Job is blameless, upright, fearing God, shunning evil. No matter what his friends, we will read, might later say, even his wife, we remember God's assessment of Job. Satan comes back and says, well, does he fear you for nothing? Or, stated another way, is there some reason he does fear you? Satan is now fulfilling the role that we see described of Satan in Revelations chapter 12, verse 10. He is the accuser of believers. Satan accuses Job before God, insisting that Job's godliness is essentially false. That is, he only serves God because of the things he could get from God. You have placed a hedge around him, you are protecting him, and you are blessing him beyond means. Of course he praises you. But what would happen if he didn't? Satan says, if you would just stretch out your hand and take these things away from him, he would curse you to your face. Satan is insisting that adversity would make or could make Job move away from his standing, his strong position of faith. God interestingly says, okay, all is in your power, except you cannot do anything to harm him. He gives Satan permission to do what Satan desires to do, which is roam the earth and devour, like a roaring lion, those in his path. And so God is going to let down the hedge of protection around Job, but not completely remove it. You cannot do anything to Job himself, is the answer, the permission given. All right. Satan had the power to attack Job all along and desires to do so. All he lacked was the permission from God to do so, that is, the laying down of the hedge of protection built around him. And so it says, Satan went out of the presence of God. Let's see, that's verse 12, the end of verse 12. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, which is not an unusual circumstance. Satan is always leaving the presence of God. The question may arise, to some extent, as Job himself will later ask, why would God allow one of his who fears him, is blameless, is upright, who shuns it, why would God allow him to be attacked by Satan? The true answer is so that God himself can be glorified, so that Satan's efforts can be defeated, and that God can show even to Satan, and at least one suggestion is to the other angelic beings, it can teach them a lesson that ultimately it is the reliance, the fear of God, the reliance upon God, the faith and trust in God that will ultimately prevail. And so he also allowed Satan to make his efforts to harm one of God's people, and yet it is Satan who is the one who is ultimately going to fail. All right, let's look at our next area of verses 13 through 19, and we're going to see the catastrophe that Satan wreaks havoc upon Job's possessions and family. And so we read, one day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you. This verse 16, while he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens. That's going to be lightning, we believe, or the scholars believe, and I believe from what I'm reading. The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, and suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." So a time occurs, and apparently very shortly after Satan's discussion with God about Job, that Job began to carry out his attacks upon Job. He maximized his work against this man of God, and he did so quickly and stunningly, thus destroying the possessions that Job had and the family that Job had. Some of the side lessons we have here is about Job's family. They gathered together, and we skipped a couple of verses earlier on. Job would pray for them every morning, not because they were sinful. They were not in festivities and riotous living depicted here in the gathering together, in a festival gathering. They were apparently, they gathered together as a family on each one's birthday and had fun and celebration. Job prayed for them daily. A great lesson to us as parents. What a great family he has, that they still gather, they still love one another and enjoy gathering. My favorite memories each year are when my family gathers together. We gather at my sister's house. This was, I would say, a tradition. We gather at Thanksgiving and at Christmas. Yeah, and some other times during the year. We just did so last week at Memorial Day weekend because of COVID. We hadn't been able to do so for a year. And we have a time of eating and celebrating. We do not have alcohol at our celebrations, at our family gatherings. We enjoy family. This was a tradition that was essentially started by my mother and enhanced by my father, because he did all of the cooking. Now we all do it and gather together. What a great picture here of the patriarch of the family. Some say the priest of the family, Job, praying for his family. They are destroyed, and messenger after messenger comes to tell Job of the catastrophes that have occurred. We won't spend a whole lot of time there. The sources of the destruction are four different earthly causes of destruction: outlaws and enemies, weather or nature, weather and or nature, showing that sometimes even God is blamed for that which Satan causes to occur. We could spend a lot of time there, but we don't have a lot of time. So let's conclude by looking at verses 20 through 22. And we read, "At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised.' In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing." Quite appropriately, Job mourned. The tearing of the clothes and the shaving of the head is an expression of extreme grief. But he fell to the ground in his grief and worshiped. And he glorifies God. Later in Job, we find him in a spiritual battle being fought all around him. But we need to notice at the beginning, his first response is to recognize God is in control. God is the source of all that he has given. We should look at everything we have as a gift of God and not something we earned, not something we deserved. And so, if something happens and it is taken away, as was in Job's case, we can understand and praise God, the same one who gave us everything. I do not deserve anything I have. I have been so blessed. I read the beginning part of Job and I say, at least the blessed part is describing me. I have a wonderful family. God has given me more than I deserve, family and possessions. He is the source, not me. And if I return to him on my deathbed with nothing, I'm going into his presence whether I have everything or I have nothing. I'm going into his presence without bringing anything with me. God is to be praised. Job recognized that it was God who gave, and the Lord can take away as well. Blessed be the name of the Lord. When we stand before God at the final day, that should be what is on our lips. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I'm looking forward to this study from Job, to look at the spiritual battle and see that ultimately God is going to comfort Job after Job, goes through this great spiritual battle of questioning God, only to find out that God has more and knows more than any of us have any knowledge of. Well, thank you for joining with us in this study this morning. Won't you come back and join us next week as we continue to study from Job? Thank you. Good morning.